So there are all kinds of ways we attempt to convince ourselves that we're really not responsible for what we're feeling. And the Gouldings used a diagram that I'll show in a moment. But if you look at how people justify their racket, they can look for evidence in their lives. For example, if my racket is anxiety, I can read about all the things that are scary things that are happening in the world and use that to support my anxiety. I can read the newspaper and do the same thing. So people will look for examples that will help them justify what it is they're feeling. The interesting thing is 6 people can look at the same event and experience 6 different feelings. It depends on how they're interpreting the event itself. So people can look for evidence in the newspaper, look for evidence on the TV news. They can talk with others who have the same racket feelings. And this is what Fanita English referred to as racketeering. You know, we just escalate each other's anger or scare or whatever. Yeah.
Can we do the thing where we like put the isms and cultural influence onto this as well? Because I'm like starting to make the connections and not totally making the connections. Because I know, for example, in the like unpleasant feelings and rackets and such, like there are certain identities, historically included identities, folks in those groups that are allowed to do that and allowed to take up space doing that, and other people who are not. So I just want to hear from y'all make that connection.
That's a great connection. I think there's also lots of, as we talk about, there are lots of cultural messages about which feelings are okay or not okay to experience. And so growing up again for myself, experiencing anger was not safe, so I escalated a different feeling from a cultural perspective. It wasn't, you know, so that's another way. And I'm also aware that in talking about the issue of internalized oppression, you know that we talk about survival behaviors, that every behavior that I developed in order to survive cultural oppression on whatever variable is at first a tribute to my strength and capacity and ability. Because if I didn't do that, I wouldn't be here, right? And we also talk about when does that become, in this language, a racket? When does it become internalized oppression, a way I'm limiting myself, personally and or culturally? So that's the link that I want us to make, is that when I notice that the system has changed around me and I'm still holding on to anger, for instance, then it gets in my own way because I don't then use my thinking to problem solve about what's getting in the way.
When people run out of ways and evidence to justify their rackets, they can always set up a psychological game. For example, if I got in a fight with my spouse before I came in the room and I'm feeling angry and irritated and there's not a stimulus in the room to justify that, I could play a kick me game and do something somebody wouldn't like, and they say something to me about it, and then I say, "You're making me angry." So I get to justify my anger and shift the responsibility to you. And people will often use games as a way to support their racket. The payoff to all games is a large amount of negative strokes, and people will use those then to justify whatever their racket feelings are. The Gouldings also developed a diagram to look at how people keep themselves in their racket. So if the horizontal line represents the past and the future, and the vertical line represents familiar places versus unfamiliar places, the center represents the here and now. And as long as I stay right in the present moment, I'm not going to be in a racket. I'm going to be feeling whatever is appropriate to the present moment. So in a group like this, where there's not a tiger walking through the door or something, and I start to feel anxious, the only way I can do that is by leaving the here and now. So I can go back into the past to think about the third grade, and I made a comment and everybody laughed and I felt humiliated. and feel anxious that if I ask a question or make a comment, that's going to happen again. Or rather than stay in the present, I jump over into the future and think about what I have to do next week or next month. I can make myself anxious about that. Or instead of staying in the present moment, I can go to some familiar place like home, think about what's happening there and feel anxious about something about that. Or I can go to some unfamiliar place like the Middle East, think about what's happening there, feel anxious about that. So when people go into rackets, they're really leaving the here and now and going to some other time and place in their mind in order to justify their feelings. Yeah.
It reminds me that I have a worry racket. My mother, very often rackets, I think you said it already, are modeled by parents.
Mm-hmm.
And both my mother and father had worry rackets, which is scary. And I have a worry racket. And I have a sense that our body has a memory of the racket. So that I always say about myself that I have a worry looking for an object to attach it to. So, because I often don't have anything to worry about, but I'll find something in order to worry. But I talk about these things that I have, but I manage them. You know, I have opportunities to manage, but it's important to see how they apply in our own lives.
As we are in our process of training others, you will notice that we often invite the client in our sessions to be in the room and to be in the here and now. And when we, and the notion of if in the here and now, what is happening in this room, in this space right now that is leading you to feel this way? And that can help people go into their adult ego state and notice that they have moved into one of those other 4 quadrants. And I know that that's also connected to a lot of practice about staying present to the moment, breathing, meditation, taking the time to really notice things around us. Again, back to the idea of art, music, et cetera, that brings us into right now. So that's another connection for the healing side.
The Gouldings used to also talk about how there's a certain sense of psychological familiarity and comfort with feeling a certain way. And so, for example, if my racket is anxiety, when I leave home and go off to college, I can take my anxiety along with me and make college feel just like home did. And then when I leave college and find a partner, get married, establish a new home, I can take my anxiety or worry or whatever along with me and make the new home feel just like the old home felt. And keep the world feeling safe and feeling familiar and feeling predictable in that way.
This is resonating deeply with me in terms of relationships, and I'm just aware of the people that are around me that have a racket of anxiety. When I observe them from afar in other contexts, they don't push that anxiety on other people. There's a way in which they're actually inviting me to engage in their racket. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
That they're confident. I see confidence in, say, a fellow consultant in the way in which they are in a training or with interrupting things in the consult. And then when I'm paired with that person, I see a different way in which they're showing up and they're literally handing me their anxiety. Literally engaging with me in a way where I don't want your anxiety. I mean, they're showing me how anxious they are, and I've seen that they're not anxious in other contexts. So there's something about the relationship with me. So I was wondering about how does that show up in particular contexts,
Yeah.
in particular
It's sometimes
pairings of relationships.
Yeah, it's sometimes referred to as emotional contagion. You will see that in groups often, as well as in one-to-one relationships. That somebody who is feeling agitated or anxious or angry, that other people will pick up that feeling and start feeling a certain degree of that also. Yeah. One other tool that I want to talk about for taking a look at rackets is what Richard Erskine and Marilyn Zaltzman described as the racket system. That's actually a closed system that people get into and just go round and round and round. And get sort of stuck in those bad feelings. So what they pointed out is that people begin with certain existential feelings and beliefs. You can substitute script there. So you might think about, for example, the last time you felt bad in some way. Just take a minute and just go back to some situation in your mind where you felt some bad feeling. And as you're there, just become aware of what you're telling yourself about the other person or persons involved and what you're saying about yourself. That's producing that unpleasant feeling. And those feelings and beliefs usually lead to a behavioral display. As you're feeling that way, just be aware of what you're experiencing. Any tension in your body, any fantasies that are generated, any tightness in the stomach or tension in the neck or any other psychosomatic things you're experiencing. And what do you do behaviorally? Do you stay present or do you withdraw or do you say something to somebody, get upset with somebody? What behaviors do you start to do? And as we begin to get into that experience, it often brings up what are called reinforcing memories, earlier times in our life where we felt similar things. And those memories tend to escalate the feelings and beliefs, which lead to additional behavioral display, which then lead to more reinforcing memories, and so on. So people get into those unpleasant feelings and just escalate them, going around and around and around. And oftentimes it's very difficult to get out of that. So what is really helpful is to look at underneath all of that, what are we feeling? And what it is that we're really wanting. And what could we do in order to get that? So somebody might have said something to me that I felt hurt about, and I get into certain behaviors, withdrawing, feeling bad, brings up memories, and I just keep escalating my hurt. When underneath, I may be feeling angry. And maybe needing to say, hold it, to set a limit. It's not okay to talk to me that way. I won't tolerate that in order to take care of myself. So underneath all that racket are natural child feelings that if we let ourselves feel will motivate us to take action to solve the problem in order to take care of ourselves. And what's important is to bring these things into awareness and then look at what's underneath and the feelings that are underneath that could really help us spontaneously solve the problem and take care of ourselves.
I think the way that we use it, the idea of substitution everybody gets, and the ways in which we do that, and that's really what's most important for the work that we're doing.
Right.
And also to recognize, I just had this thought about, as we're thinking about working in institutions, it's also important to know some institutions also send messages about what feelings are okay and what are not okay. And there can be rackets that develop, substitutions that develop among employees as a way to survive in an organization. Right. So it has implications there, and I think that's really important. And it made me also go to our U.S. Congress. It would be powerful to analyze it from this frame of reference in terms of what's allowed and what's not allowed at all of the levels. So there's ways we can use it and I'm actually looking forward to having fun with you all to create other ways that we can apply this that update it and that allow it to get the gems of it to continue to grow. Yeah.
My question is just thinking about how technology now can actually be this really terrible tool to help us to sort of collude in our own justification of our rackets.
Right.
I had an experience in the last couple of years having a baby and experiencing postpartum anxiety and literally noticing how the news feed on my phone started feeding me. I read some terrible story about something terrible happening to a child. And then suddenly every day I was getting more of these stories. And I'm just noticing how that was feeding my anxiety.
Right.
And so I'm just, I don't know, I'm sure this is a huge can of worms, but I'm just curious if you have any comments or resources or anything sort of connecting the justification of rackets with technology and social media and whatnot.
The internet is a tremendous source of racketeering.
Okay, I get that a racket is a substitute feeling, and therefore it's an inauthentic feeling. But it still has intensity. It still has.
That's right.
So it still is a feeling,
That's right.
but it's inauthentic.
And people will experience it as very real.
Yeah. That makes it confusing to diagnose. Is it real or is it not? Because I'm still feeling something.
Yeah.
I would say that you don't. If I use a substitute feeling, I don't get what the need met. So I would say it's an ineffective, not functional.
Exactly.
Whether I wouldn't go with real, unreal. It's real, but it's not helpful. Because if I need to yell and I'm crying out of sadness because I'm afraid to yell, I'm not getting the need met. I'm not getting the need met. So that might be another way to think about it.
Right.
Physical symptoms, illness, it can be a racket, and the illness is real, even though they feel it intensely, yeah.
All right.
Physical illness, physical symptoms can be a racket if it was stroked a lot for children that were growing up. And even though it's a racket instead of something else, an indirect way of getting something else, you still feel sick.
Right.
So using that analogy, you need to attend to it, right? You'd have to attend to the sickness in order to get underneath what's going. I mean, I'm just wanting to sort of understand the process of undoing a racket, if you will, right? Because I think that's what my question is. So if it's manifesting in physical sickness or it's manifesting in a feeling that is inauthentic, I understand in substitution, but more in the racket context, I'm trying to understand how do you get it resolved?
Well, two things come to my mind is how do you get it resolved if you realize that illness is your racket? That's a different process than how to not reinforce a racket if you relate with somebody who has an illness or an angry racket. I have a friend who has an illness racket. We've been friends since college. And what I do is sometimes I make a mistake and say, how are you feeling? But generally, and he'll go into a lot of how he's feeling, and I try to not reinforce it a lot, try to make it shorter, somehow or another cross the transaction. So, that's but I think you were asking about how do you do it if it's your own racket, if you realize that I have an angry or a scared racket. And I was talking about my worry racket. So what I do is work a lot on other ways to do instead of, my scare racket is instead of being peaceful. So I work on being peaceful. I have worked with a lot of couples, for instance, and you were talking about shifting discomfort, where one of the partners is angry all the time and does not experience fear or sadness, and the other partner will act the fear and sadness out. So the angry racket is instead of scare, and the other partner in the relationship will act out the scare.
Rather than anger.
Yeah. I had a client like that who she was always scared and never angry. And what she was talking about, what was going on in the relationship, would have made her angry. And so it was helping her move into owning that anger and upsetness and confronting her husband about the behavior.
What often is helpful is to really listen to the racket, to what the person is experiencing and what they're telling themselves and thinking and the dimensions of that, and then to ask, and underneath that, what are you feeling? until you get to the natural feeling that's not being expressed. And that's what they need to use to solve the problem.
I have an example of a form of like racket exchange that happens cross-culturally that I've been trying to, I don't know, it's just real. Like when I'm walking down the street and a white person like smiles at me and I know it's a fake smile, and then I feel forced to smile back, when really what I feel is that they are expressing their fear of me through this racket of joy, and then I'm forced, so as not to be the angry black person, to then express the same racket or like mirror that racket back, which I'm actually angry at that point. And I think that stuff like that happens all the time, like between men and women, or between like, you know, any target group and non-target group, of like these unspoken exchanges of rackets.
One of the things that we've done is develop this idea of modernisms and internalized oppression, this dance. And that is a game system that includes a racket, absolutely. And so how do I notice that in myself? And then, like you said, if there's a stimulus that is that, then what choice do I make about how I respond?